We've done a lot of work over the past 30 years on training and pruning almond trees, up and down the state from Kern County all the way up to Chico and every place in between. And we've looked at mature tree pruning, we've looked at temporary trees, we've looked at hedging and topping and training young trees in different ways. And so what I thought I would do today is focus on what Catherine asked me to talk about, and that was pruning and training of almond trees going for about the first 5 years of what we would like to see done to get a good tree off to a start and to try to maximize early production and at the same time minimize some of your pruning costs. So that's kind of what I'm going to be focusing on today. And at the same time, I'm going to show you some of the different alternatives to pruning and what pruning in those ways looks like. So that's what I have for you today. Okay, first of all, I wanted to go over the almond bearing habit. And if you're not completely familiar with almonds, it's important to know how they bear fruit and what it takes for new shoot growth to come into bearing and to be productive. And if you change that, then you can keep the tree growing vegetatively, delay the time when it comes into bearing, and lose a lot of production in what might be the third leaf harvest. So what you see on this particular slide, of course, is that you've got growth here that represents 3 years of growth. And I'm going to see which one of these is brightest. Not that one. That one. Well, okay. All right. What we can see here is that you've got 1 year growth up here at the end. This is the last year's shoot growth, so it's a year old. This would be the first dormant season. Then you've got 2 year wood right below that. And on the 2 year wood, it grew the previous year, and then it grew spurs off of that wood at those bud positions. And so then these spurs are what become productive. And then the 3 year wood down here has spurs that were formed. It has originally a short shoot with flower buds developing on the 1 year wood that grew here in this distance, just like this wood grew up here. And then you can see the peduncles here where the crop was born on those shoots in that second year. So that's kind of the bearing habit of almond. And what we want to do is grow shoots, develop the spur bearing growth, because that's what's going to maximize our yield. So almond shoots, when you look at them, would look like this. They're going to form flower buds the previous July to October. So you've got to have good conditions during that July to October period for the following year's bloom. So that's why controlling mites and water stress during the growing season is important. And you can see on these shots the development of the spurs there on the picture on the right, and some of the short shoots that also have some flower buds on them. So almonds are born primarily laterally on the spur growth, and they'll produce some nuts on the shoots, but mostly on these spurs. So you want to allow the wood to grow and then spur up, and that's what's going to make it the most productive. And normally we start out an orchard with bare root trees a lot of times. That's been the historical way it's been done, and by heading them at planting time. And we want to try to plant them, cut them back to about 36 to 40 inches or so, trim off the side branches, and that's going to promote good establishment of these bare root trees that have had their root system truncated in the nursery by undercutting them and uprooting them and then getting them to you. And of course, once they're cut back, we finish with a tree wrap, mainly to help keep herbicides off the trunk, to prevent rabbits from chewing on them, and sunburn low on the trunk and things like that. Now things are changing a little bit in the world right now. And the nurseries that have been growing bare root trees are under the gun as far as losing their soil fumigants, just like we've been losing our soil fumigants in pre-plant fumigation in our orchards. And so they're all working at trying to develop potted trees with sterile media so that they can get away from this fumigation problem. The ideal planting time for these potted trees is really in this October-November period, so that they can grow roots and get established a little bit before they wake up in the spring. But it's really important to plant into good soil moisture and not too deep. So we need to try try planting at that time, use a tree wrap, and then be ready to water them in if it's not already raining and our soil moisture is not good at the time we plant. So those are some critical things about potted trees that are a little bit different. And of course, because they already have a root system and because the top is somewhat limited, they come as a pretty small tree compared to a bare root tree, we don't need to worry about pruning them back at planting time. You just plant them and then wait for the spring to come along. So the reason that we're training young trees really is to develop good structural strength in the primary branches and also to guide the tree to safely fill the available space in the orchard and to manage rapid growth and encourage early production. So that's what we're after, and that's what all of our training is really focused on. The time of pruning trees affects the response to pruning. And so if you're dormant pruning, like the picture on the right, that is an invigorative type pruning. It's when you cut something back in the dormant period, the buds that remain below the cut are going to grow very vigorously. On the other hand, if you have trees that are too vigorous, and this is not normally something most of our growers worry about, spring and summer pruning is going to reduce vigor or be dwarfing. So that's the kind of response you get. If you had something like a pear tree that was just growing like crazy and you couldn't even slow the thing down, don't dormant prune it because it'll keep invigorating it. If you have that, maybe you want to summer prune it and redirect some of the growth, and it'll slow it down and make the growth more regular. Now, Wilbur Reel, Catherine's predecessor here in Yolo County, studied some of the effects of pruning time on bearing almonds, and Wilbur was a great farm advisor here. I'm sure many of you knew him. He found whether trees were pruned in mid-October or November or December, there was really no effect on these bearing trees on yield, on tree growth, or on leaf nutrient levels, or on the incidence of limb disease. And that's because when we prune things off, most of the energy that is produced by the leaves is stored in the wood close to those leaves. Some of it translocates further down, but in his work he found that if we cut things off, it was mainly just taking off the nutrients and things that were in that wood and that would have been there for the growth of the buds on the wood you pruned off. So you didn't really lose anything in the rest of the tree. So when is the best time to prune? If we talked about that, really then any time from October to January, it works, at least as far as Wilbur's work goes on bearing trees. And I think on young trees, there are some considerations that are a little bit different than that. We want to consider a delayed dormant timing if we have threats from bacterial canker. If you happen to be on real sandy soil where bacterial canker is more of a risk, then it's important to maybe do some delayed dormant pruning rather than pruning early in the dormant season, which can aggravate bacterial canker. Also, you want to avoid pruning prior to heavy rains when training young trees in that first or second dormant season. And that's a nice thing to say, but it's sometimes difficult to do because the problem is we don't know when we're going to have heavy rains. And there have been years where our pathologists told us, well, why don't we prune early so that we can get the pruning done and the pruning wounds can heal before it starts raining. Well, that's the year then when you have 15 inches of rain by the end of November. Then others have said, well, let's prune late in January because most of the rainy season will be behind us, and that's the year that it rains 15 inches in March. So it's really hard to tell when it's going to rain. So all I would say with this is that we know that those pruning wounds on those first and second year trees are fairly large compared to the size of the trunk at that time, and they can be susceptible to Botryopsphera or Phytophthora pruning wound cankers if we have extended wet periods following those open pruning wounds. What do we do about that? There's some research work underway right now looking at Botryopsphera, and we've done some work in the past looking at Phytophthora. We know that one of the benefits of a dormant copper spray is that the copper is toxic to Phytophthora spores. So, you know, if I was doing first year pruning on first dormant season pruning and making lots of fairly good sized cuts on a young tree, I might spray them with a winter copper just to protect those cuts right after the pruning is done before heavy rain might move in. So on mature trees, it's important to prune early to see dead wood so that you can prune that out. And typically, if you're just thinning, then that's easily done when it's dormant, so you can see what you're doing. Training, the first dormant season is really the most critical thing that we do. And You want to try to space the scaffolds vertically, at least 3 inches if possible. That requires topping the newly planted trees at that 36 to 40 inch range or so, up about here, so that you have some distance to hopefully select some scaffolds over that distance. You want to try to avoid real flat scaffolds that aren't going to be very vigorous, or very vertically growing ones, which tend to have attachment problems where the scaffold originates, because you want to avoid embedded bark. And that's a real problem on a primary scaffold that's going to have structural strength for the long term. So we try to select maybe 3 or 4 strong scaffolds that are vertically spaced, like you see here on the left, up and down the trunk, and radially around the trunk on the left, 3 of them on the right there. That's kind of what we want to strive for. And we really want to watch out for this. This is in training new trees, this is the one thing that's really pretty critical. This is a shot of embedded bark here, and you can see right here there's bark moving all the way down between this limb and the main trunk. And that means there's no good union here between the wood here and the wood here. So if you pulled on that limb, that embedded bark area would actually open up as a little crack. So it's not well attached there. So you want to avoid selecting primary scaffolds that have that problem. What you really want to do is select limbs that have a little bit wider angle, roughly about 45 degrees in a lot of cases. And here you'll see that there isn't really this embedded bark area. You have a little branch bark ridge right here where the bark is being kind of pushed up and out of the way, so that there's a good connection between the wood in the primary scaffold and the main trunk. So that's what you want to try to achieve. Other things that you want to avoid when you're training new trees is avoid selecting opposite limbs. If you have 2 opposite limbs, like you see there on the left, they can compete with the leader and sometimes choke it out. Or you want to also watch out for limbs that are starting at exactly the same place, like we see on the picture there on the right. And the reason that that's important is what can happen with that is something like this. It can go from a great looking young tree there on the right to all of a sudden starting to have a bit of a problem here where there's some cracks developing, and as that gets bigger it can just push the tree apart. So by the time it's maybe 5 or 6, when you should be coming into great production, it starts to come apart on you. And so you want to be aware of that one thing in training trees, because you don't want to have these kind of losses take place either when the trees are fairly young, or certainly not when they're coming into bearing, where you suddenly lose a whole tree that you've invested 5 or 6 years developing it in. We also, of course, want to watch out for water sprouts and suckers. Remove water sprouts that are coming from the main primary scaffolds that are essentially trying to make, instead of 3 or 4 scaffolds, maybe they're trying to make 6 or 8 if you leave them on there, and that's maybe too much. And you want to remove any suckers that are coming from below the graft union on the rootstock or from the roots. So we want to watch out for that. Now I'm going to talk about some of the trials that have been done over the years. In Butte County, I did a training, pruning, and then tree removal trial starting in 1980. It ran for about 18 years. Glenn County, Bill Kruger did another trial starting in 2005. And both of us examined some different training methods, somewhat similar in nature. And the treatments were the ones that you see listed here. Bill had a multi-scaffold treatment in his Glenn County trial where he took out problem limbs, just opened up the center slightly, but saved 6 or 8 scaffolds and left them unheaded. And then he had a long pruning treatment with 3 or 4 scaffolds that were left unheaded, an intermediate pruning treatment where they were scaffolds, the primary scaffolds were selected, and then they were lightly headed, and then a short pruning treatment that had 3 or 4 scaffolds that were headed back at 18 inches. And you still see some short pruning done in orchards today. So what I'm going to do now is go through each of those types of training and show you what they look like and talk a little bit about them. The multi-scaffold and the long pruning system essentially is accomplished through thinning cuts, where we remove entire branches or shoots, and when you can prevent crowding, it improves sunlight penetration, and thinning defines the main branches. So you have branches that you've selected that have good angles of attachment, that don't have embedded bark, and then those thinning cuts define which branches will end up building your tree and making a good, strong canopy for the future. In the multi-scaffold pruning, Bill kept 6 or 8 primary unheaded branches. He thinned out the problem limbs, had minimal thinning of secondary branches after that. And the advantages to this was that you had less pruning needed at the second dormant season because you weren't cutting the tree as hard in the first dormant season. You had greater early yield and a good harvest in the third leaf. And the drawbacks to this system was possible need for tying in the second and the third growing seasons. Limbs became very crowded as the trees aged, and so if you had to do any corrective pruning, you ended up with very large pruning wounds that were there if you had to saw a limb off that was coming out into the middle and getting in the way of the tractor or the weed sprayer or something like that. This is what multi-scaffold pruning looked like in Bill's trial. This is a tree at the third dormant season, so after third dormancy, after 3 growing seasons. And you can see the thinned, he thinned out the problem limbs. It's fairly open, not too crowded, not a bunch of water sprout growth anywhere, and some good fruit wood. Now, the other approach is long pruning, and that's where we select those primaries. They're unheaded. We try to select primary and secondary branches by thinning out upright, vigorous competing branches. And the advantages to this system are, again, less pruning is needed because you're not pruning so hard that you're stimulating a lot of water sprouts. You could expect early yield, harvesting in the third leaf. And the main drawback to this system is the fact that you probably need to do some tying in the second and third years if you expect to get the heavy production that is possible with this type of a system. This is an example of a first dormant long pruning, before on the left and then after on the right, just done with some thinning cuts. Nothing's headed back. Was done early in the season, as you see here, right about probably in October, early November. And then this is what a long pruned tree looked like at the third dormant season. So primary and secondary scaffolds were selected, as I mentioned, by thinning out and thinning out the upright competing branches. Here you've got a tree that's really got a nice form. It's got a lot of fruit wood on it. It has good angles of attachment and doesn't have any problem with impeding with weed sprayers or the middles in the orchard. No heading was done on this tree, and they saved as much lateral fruit wood as they could. The next one is intermediate pruning, and this is a system where we're selecting primary and secondary branches, again by thinning, and then we head the primaries with a light tipping pruning just below what I would call closely spaced buds, and they'd be headed back with a length of about 36 to 48 inches. And when I say heading back closely spaced buds, I've got a little illustration there on the right, and you notice in the first growing season, you're going to have vigorous growth, hopefully, and then towards if everything's going well, and Blake showed you a couple of slides of a tree that was water stressed that slowed down and stopped and had very closely packed buds, and also the zinc deficiency, and then the other slide had nice shoot elongation with the buds still spread out. And you can kind of see that here, not necessarily water stressed, but even just towards the end of the growing season. You'll have buds that are spread out as the shoot is growing vigorously, and then towards the end of the season, either due to water stress or just slower growth as the tree is approaching dormancy, you start to have slower growth here and the buds get very closely packed together. Well, almonds branch freely, so next spring all those buds are going to push. And what you end up with is a top knot of growth right up here, which on a primary scaffold on a new tree makes it a bit top heavy and it's liable to flop over. So by doing some intermediate pruning and just tipping, maybe taking off the terminal 8, 10, 12 inches, something like that, then you cut down to where you've got buds that are more spaced out, and you can get a little bit better scaffold development, secondary scaffold development coming out of that kind of wood that way. So you'll get greater early yield compared to short pruning. There's less need to thin water sprouts compared to short pruning, and maybe less need to tie trees in the second leaf compared to long pruning. And the drawback to this is maybe less yield compared to non-pruning or multi-scaffold pruning, which we don't generally recommend. Now, this is a shot of intermediate pruning at the second dormant season. You can see where where the scaffolds were tipped here, and then the secondaries came out below that, so you get this kind of crow's nest of branches. And of course then what you need to do is do some thinning to thin out some of those secondaries and remove competing limbs, but save as much of the lateral fruitwood as possible. And then finally, here's another one, a tree after the second dormant pruning. This has a pretty good structure, but you can see here that it's really been over pruned. We know that when we prune, the more wood we take off, the more we reduce yield. That's the bottom line result from all of the pruning trials we've done. I'll end with that as a summary just to reinforce it. But you've got good structure, but more fruitwood was taken out of this than you really need. So you've got your primary scaffolds, you've got very strict secondary scaffold selection, and they've kind of stripped off a lot of the small fruitwood that would have been down in here that would not have been competing with the secondary scaffolds or the development of the whole tree. But by doing that, they're essentially going to lower their yield. So that's a little bit more open than it needs to be. This, on the other hand, is a little bit thicker than it needs to be. This is the third dormant season with intermediate pruning, and again you can kind of see where it was tipped right up in here at the end of the first growing season. Lots of growth there, and if you zoom in on some of these and look close at them, you can see that, you know, we've got what, maybe 8, 10 sometimes branches coming off right below those cuts, and so those secondaries kind of need to be thinned out. More thinning is really desirable. Short pruning, on the other hand, does this. You'll get a terminal part of primary scaffold removed, stimulates vigorous branch growth. Just below the cuts, it produces water sprouts on the primaries, and it increases the need for thinning, reducing sunlight penetration. So you'd have to do a lot more pruning there. So you can teach it pretty easily to a pruning crew. Tying is not initially required, but the drawbacks are reduced early yield. It guarantees the need for significant pruning in the second dormant season and thinning, and that comes at a cost. So you also often have to tie trees in the third to the fifth leaf. Short pruning like this would lead to excessive water sprouts, the need for pruning the next year, and a delay in yield that really does have a significant cost. So it also opens up a lot of wounds a lot of times for potential canker diseases, and you can see here how many cuts were made to try to thin this out once it was short pruned. So short pruning in the third dormant season might look like this if it wasn't if it wasn't thinned back. You've got the short pruning down in here and then lots of growth, and again terrible crowding in here that really kind of needs to be thinned out. If you don't do that and you imagine these 1-inch limbs, after another growing season they're going to be 2-inch limbs. They're all going to be running into each other, and they're a lot more difficult to deal with at that point. So the conclusions of our Butte County trials are that the more you prune, the lower the yield. Little to no pruning is going to give us the highest early yields, but if you sacrifice some early yield for good scaffold development, I think it's really worth it, because that's when the yield is the lowest anyway. You know, you try to get early yield by saving all this wood, and then you have some of these other problems, potential splitting. So minimal training makes corrective pruning more costly later if you have to come in and make large cuts like that, and you lose any advantage you might have gained by minimal pruning to begin with. This is a training trial in Glenn County where Bill had these 4 treatments, and you can see the effects on yield over here. The less pruning that was done, the heavier the yield. You know, short pruned trees were pruned severely, and that affected the yield the most. So that's kind of what you can expect. This is third leaf yield, so it's going to affect those early yields. We know that we can expect long pruned trees to open up and require more tying. Intermediate pruned trees with light tipping require some tying, and the short pruned trees and multi-scaffold trees required less. These trees probably should have been tied in the second dormant season. This is the third growing season. They began to open up in April, getting a little bit heavy and starting to flop over. They didn't want to lose the primary scaffolds, and so they came in with a light mechanical tipping, and that really saved the day. And you notice we're not really hedging or topping these. They're just catching the ends, the very ends of some of these branches that were getting top heavy and that were going to flop over and kind of umbrella on the grower. And if that had happened, he would have lost his secondary scaffolding. He would have had a terrible mess, and by just taking a little bit of weight off in April, it solved the problem. Tying them would have probably been a better solution. By the time you get to the 3rd to 5th growing seasons and the dormant seasons, if you've done proper training in that 1st and 2nd dormant season, you really should only need to do a little bit of light touch-up pruning, allow the upper canopy to fill in, and then maintain the original structure. And in the Nichols estate in Arbuckle, John Edstrom in 1979 pruning trial trained trees to 3 scaffolds, as you see here on the right, and then never pruned them again after that. So the first dormant season they weren't pruned for 20 years. What that did is the lower wood all shaded out, the top of the canopy is where the crop was, and once they were trained and the structure was set, then minimum pruning really made sense for this because he maximized yield in those trees. So, but minimum pruning or unpruned treatments in our trials don't mean no initial pruning. So I think it's important to remember that. The pruning trial that Roger Duncan's been doing down in Stanislaus County, all his yields were similar by the 8th leaf, so it gave you a little advantage early on. The standard pruned trees had the lowest yield, the unpruned trees had the highest yield, but they also had more blowover problems, and they also had early scaffold failures, splitting out of those scaffolds, so you don't really want to go down that road. Trees that were initially trained in Roger's trial to 3 scaffolds and then not pruned after that 2nd leaf really looked very acceptable to him. They were some of the best trees in his trial. They had no scaffold breakage, no problems for equipment operators later, and they weren't overly dense. This is some yield data from Roger's trial on the 15th leaf and cumulative data. You can see his trials, his treatments over here. And essentially what this is showing us is that the same story. The less you prune, the heavier the yield. The more you prune, the lighter the yield. So where they continued to do pruning here on the training to 3 scaffolds and then 3 annual cuts each year, the B here indicates a lower yield, as does this one, where they were doing moderate pruning annually and opening the centers, and the accumulated yield is lower somewhat compared to no scaffold selection and no annual pruning, which had the highest long-term yields here in both of the varieties, or almost both of the varieties. But this one that was trained to 3 scaffolds and then unpruned after the 2nd year, you can see did very well. It was doing just as well as the unpruned in terms of significance here, and virtually the same yield, accumulated yield over that 15-year period. So the reasons to prune mature trees are to remove dead wood and diseased wood. This is where ultimately we go. After we've got everything trained and everything's good and we're getting good yields, we need to think about mature trees, and so we remove dead and diseased wood. We try to control the height by thinning to lower laterals to reduce blowovers. And then we prune mature trees to what I would say is to facilitate all the other cultural practices that you have to do in your orchard. So no pruning is not a really good idea. We still need to do weed spraying. We need to mow out in the middles. You want to make sure your worker safety is okay. You don't want to get knocked off the tractor and chopped up by the flail mower. You want to dry nuts at harvest through improved light penetration. In some orchards that are too dense, that's been a real problem. So we might need to do a little pruning to open things up, let some sunlight down inside the tree or out into the middle. And this is going to help promote more uniform hull split and also crop maturity, and that's important from a worm management standpoint. If you've got nuts that open in the top and nuts that open late down on the inside where it's heavily shaded, you can't harvest, and so the nuts that opened early are more susceptible to worm damage. So having some light penetration is important for a number of reasons. So what we know about pruning is that pruning both dwarfs and invigorates trees depending on when you do it. It initially is going to reduce yield in the early training years if you take the time to do a good job training trees. We know that lack of pruning in mature trees is going to move production to the outside of the canopy and up to the top of the canopy. It's not going to reduce production, it's just going to move it. So the lack of pruning can also reduce nut size to some extent, not a lot, not enough to influence yield, but you may have slightly smaller nuts. And there are some really good reasons to prune, but you want to know why you're pruning and what you're trying to achieve with that pruning. You don't want to just look at the orchard and say, okay, this orchard needs pruning. Well, probably not. If you did nothing, it would probably do better than if you went in and did a lot of pruning. So overall, in multiple pruning trials in different parts of California, we've consistently shown that pruning is going to reduce yield. The more you prune, the more you reduce yield. So you want to prune for a good reason. But sometimes you need to prune and you need to accept yield sacrifice in order to get strong trees that are going to last for the long term in your orchard and be productive for the whole life of the tree. So getting a new orchard off to a good start by selecting strong scaffolds in the first couple of years is one of those times when pruning is a smart thing to be doing. And if everything goes well, you may have trees that can live 100 years, particularly if they happen to be on almond rootstock. This is one of the largest almond trees I'd ever run into. So that's what I had for you today. I wanted to give a quick overview. As I say, we've done lots of pruning, and there's information on the Almond Board's website about pruning trials and results from all sorts of different trials. But anyway, that's it for right now. So thank you.